Before continuing, I would like to acknowledge that Concordia University is located in Jojake, or Montreal, what was and remains a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, the Gadian-Gahaga Nation is recognized as custodians of these lands. And to pursue on that, our topic today is about ensuring representation of underrepresented groups in Quebec's provincial governments. Indigenous people are thankfully recognized in Quebec's employment equity program, though they continue to be underrepresented in the government. But today we're looking at Quebec's English speakers. Now, these categories don't need to be mutually exclusive. Many Indigenous nations would also benefit from compounded intersectional access that includes English speakers, since most Indigenous people in Quebec have English as their first official language, and many Gadian-Gahaga have it as their mother tongue. So while they may not identify necessarily as anglophone, access to English language services is a shared concern with between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities that could benefit from a stronger voice in government. This event is made possible through the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. Questcrin also receives funding from Canadian Heritage and from Concordia University. Now, please note this is a space for intellectual exchange, and that any views or opinions expressed in this talk, including my own, do not necessarily represent those of Questcrin or its funders. And it is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Richard Bourhis. Richard Bourhis has taught psychology at McMaster University in Ontario and at l'Université du Québec à Montréal, where he is Emeritus Professor. He published extensively on discrimination and intergroup relations, language policies, cross-cultural communication, immigration, and acculturation. He was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and was awarded the Gold Medal Award of the Canadian Psychological Society. If you have any questions for Richard about this presentation, reminder to please include them in the Q&A box, and we will address them during the Q&A period after the panel. So I now pass the mic over to Richard.
Well, bon après-midi, good afternoon. I wish you a good meal, and I hope you'll be entertained with some of this material that I'll be covering today. I'll be able to answer questions in French and English, but we're just decided to do it in English for given the theme of the talk. So there's the theme. So it's proposals for including English-speaking Quebecers in the Programme d'accès à l'égalité à l'emploi. We can translate it as the Quebec Employment Equity Program, and it's not exactly the translation, but that's the one we can use for this talk for the moment. So the next slide. Okay, Anna, for the next. Okay, good. So a bit of historical background on la Commission des droits de la personne et de la jeunesse, CDPDJ. So the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms was adopted by the Quebec government in 1975. Article 10 of the Charter prohibits discrimination based on gender, ethnic, racial origin, language, age, sexual orientation, physical and mental handicap, and other criteria. The director and the 12 members of la Commission des droits de la personne et de la jeunesse, CDPDJ, are volunteers, but then they are elected by the Quebec government to apply the anti-discrimination provisions of the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedom. And there are 3 permanent members of the commission, and there's the others are part-time. When it's a relatively important, it is an important group of people working on this issue. A first mandate of the commission is to receive complaints by citizens and youth who have been victim of discrimination based on criteria listed in Article 10 of the Charter. So next slide. Some historical background to the Programme d'accès à l'égalité à l'emploi. In line with this anti-discrimination goals, the Employment Equity Program was implemented in 2001 to ensure equal employment opportunities for underrepresented groups within the Quebec public administration, which includes the ministries and the various bodies. To this day, there's 5 designated groups that have benefited with better representation in the Quebec public administration. These are women, visible minorities, ethnic minorities, Indigenous people, and handicapped persons. Next. The work of the Programme d'accès à l'égalité à l'emploi is also the idea of tracking how many of these vulnerable minorities have been employed in the Quebec public administration. And they have a report every year, and they have a major report, rapport triennal, every 3 years. And these are very extensive reports. They're very well done, and I recommend them. They do a great job, and they facilitate our understanding of how this whole outfit works. And it's a very big amount of work that they do. I'll say a few words about the 2022 report, which was published in 2023. At that point in the Quebec public administration, we had a total number of employees of 774,000 employees in the Quebec public administration. And that makes the Quebec government the biggest employer in the province. And that number has been increased from the 2009 numbers, which was half, because the Quebec government has included health and social services within this employment equity program. So that's the reason why there's this big jump between the number of employees in 2009, which was 338,000, which now is 774,000. Now, just a few statistics, and I'm not going to, but to show you how much work there's been done for this. For women representation amongst these 774,000, we have now 507,000, well, 508,000 women representing 68% of the workforce. For Indigenous people, we have 3,298, which represent 0.4 of 1% of the public workforce. Then we have visible minorities. That's 83,000 employees, representing 11.2% of the Quebec workforce, in the government workforce. And we have ethnic minorities, 27,000, representing 3.7% of the workforce. And then recently, so it's since about 8 years, we have the handicapped people, 6,574, representing almost 1% of the workforce. And on that slide, you see on your right, you have indicateur cible des minorités à pourvoir, which is the goal or the targets they have to fulfill the numbers so that they're commensurate with the representation of these groups in Quebec society. So that's just a slight look at the amount of work that's involved here. So next slide. So this paper proposes to include Quebec anglophones as a 6th group targeted for the Quebec Employment Equity Program. In their question research paper, Cooper, Donovan, and O'Donnell noted that Quebec anglophones were not included in the 2001 Quebec Employment Equity Program. Traditionally, anglophone candidates were more likely to join employment in the federal public administration than in the Quebec one. Based on 2021 census, only 1% of Quebec public servants are anglophones, though the mother tongue anglophone population in Quebec represents 10% of the population. Also, based on first official language spoken, only 3.3% of the Quebec public servants are anglophones, though they represent 13.7% of the Quebec population based on first official language spoken. Next slide. So we have the issue here that if we want to include anglophones in the Quebec public administration, we got to know what their definition is. I'm just giving you 2 of them, but I think that it's a point that would have to be discussed much further. So who is an anglophone to be included? Well, as in the Canadian census, Quebec anglophones can self-declare as anglophones based on their mother tongue. That's the simplest thing you could do. Or you could have Quebec anglophones could self-declare based on their first official language spoken, which would be mother tongue, plus knowledge of English, plus language spoken most often at home, maybe a combination of those three. So the next slide. So we also just have a slight look at the demolinguistic and language or language planning issues. So of course we've had the Charter of the French Language, Bill 101, which was adopted by the Parti Québécois in 1977, which enshrined the status and use of French as the official language of Quebec. Population based on first official language spoken in our 2021 census, what we have is 82% of the population, which is first official language speakers, which represents about 7 million people. And if we have English as first official language speakers, that's 13% of the population, representing about 1 million people. By the 2021 census, other language laws adopted by the Quebec government succeeded in having 96% of the Quebec population declaring a knowledge of French sufficient to hold a conversation. So language planning in Quebec has had quite a lot of success. There's still things that people talk about as regards some threats, but the very basic numbers are pretty good by world language planning comparisons. The next slide. Okay. Candidates for the Quebec government jobs must successfully pass required professional qualifications that include proficiency tests in French. So if we want to have anglophones in the Quebec public administration, they have to pass the French language test, the proficiency test. Do we have linguistic capital in Quebec amongst anglophones and francophones in terms of being French-English bilinguals? Well, back in 71, anglophone, 37% of Quebec anglophones declared that they were bilingual in French and English. And at that time, francophones, there were 25% that declared that they were bilingual in French and English. In 2001, we have anglophones who were 66% bilingual and francophones 38%, roughly. And in our latest census, 2021, we have 71% of anglophones that declare themselves as bilingual in the census, and francophones that are 42. So there's an increasing number of bilinguals in the Quebec province. And what we're saying here is that we have an increasing number of anglophones who are already can self-define themselves as being bilingual. And so there is a pool of people, of anglophone people who could apply for Quebec government jobs and pass these various language proficiency tests. Also, in terms of education, we have 85.5% of anglophones that have a post-secondary degree, and amongst francophones, we have 81.6%. So there is also cultural and educational capital there that can join the Quebec public administration. Next slide. So what indicators should we use for including Quebec anglophones as a sixth vulnerable group within the Quebec employment equity program? We can monitor disadvantages of anglophone minorities compared to francophone majority based on annual median income, unemployment rate. We could have poverty rate. We also have been the victim of discrimination, including what we call linguicism that we'll talk about. And we have anglophone perceptions that they do not have equal access to Quebec government jobs. So these are indicators we want to talk about for a few minutes in this talk. So the next slide. So let's look at annual income of francophone majority. And it's actually now higher than that of the anglophone minority since the 21st century. And of course, we have the Statistics Canada data and the PERT reports that attest to this situation. So anglophone median incomes is less than francophone majority income based on first official language spoken per year. In the 2011 census, anglophones had a median income of 27,000, and francophones had a median annual income of 29,000. And in 2021, as you can see, anglophones had 32,000 and francophones had 37,000. And this is the case, this advantage for the francophones, median annual income advantage in the 15 of the 17 administrative regions of Quebec. So the next slide. So this is the slide which shows that in each of the 17 administrative regions, except for 2, francophones have a better income than anglophones, including in regions of the Quebec where there's very few immigrants. And so we're really talking about a pretty strong trend here. So next slide. Now we can look at Quebec unemployment rate. Now, in 2021, for the whole province, it was 7.6% unemployment rate at the time of the Canadian census of 2021. And what we find is that anglophones had an unemployment rate of 10.9%, based on first official language spoken, of course, and francophones at 6.9%. So anglophones have a higher unemployment rate than francophones in each of the 17 administrative regions of Quebec. And you can see there in black, that's the anglophone unemployment rate. And it's systematically higher than that of the francophone right across the province. Next slide. We can also look at Quebec poverty rate in 2021, based on Statistics Canada again, and a detailed report conducted by PERT, published in 2023. So poverty rate, well, we use le seuil de faible revenu. And the seuil de faible revenu, SFR, that we use in l'Institut de Statistique du Québec, it's income level at which a person spends a greater share of his income than the general population for basic necessities such as food, lodging, and clothing. So poor people. So the poverty rate amongst anglophones is 8.9%, and the poverty rate for francophones is 4.5%. So again, anglophones have a higher poverty rate than francophones. And anglophones have a higher poverty rate than francophones in 16 of the 17 administrative regions of the province. As you can see again, the bar graph in black, that's the anglophones. They always have a higher poverty rate except for one place. So that's another indicator that we can use. Next slide. Now, in Canada, as elsewhere in the world, discrimination remains a pervasive phenomenon that is corrosive for its victims and ultimately dehumanizing for its perpetrators. So let's look at what information we do have on discrimination in Canada. Next slide. Discrimination is defined as favoritism towards members of one's own group, and often a negative behavior aimed at members of an outgroup that is a target of our prejudice. Okay, that's sort of a working definition. Now, when discrimination targets ethnic groups, we call it racism, as you know. When discrimination targets women or men, we call it sexism. When discrimination targets younger or older persons, we call it ageism. And when discrimination targets outgroups that speak a different language or accent, we call it linguicism. So, based on accent and language. So, and then we have institutional linguicism may occur when a language minority enacts or adopts a language law that imposes restrictions or unfair treatment on targeted language minorities. And these cases are discussed in language planning literature and sociolinguistics. Next slide. So, we're looking now at a study to in order to monitor discrimination and linguicism. And the study we're looking at is the Ethnic Diversity Survey, which was conducted by Statistics Canada, Canadian Heritage, and Citizenship and Immigration. It was a big study. We had over 42,476 telephone interviews, which were conducted with a stratified sample of a Canadian population age 15 and more, living in the 10 provinces and territories, and in major cities including Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. The response rate for this survey was 76%, which was very good. And a lot of the results are published in a book by Wrights, Breton, and Dion. The ethnic diversity survey included 33% of the respondents representing English Canadians of British origin and French Canadians of different origins, including the Québécois, Acadians, and Franco-Ontariens. And that represented 14,158 interviews. The ethnic diversity survey oversampled 67 respondents of ethnic backgrounds, including first and second and third generation immigrants from Europe and visible minorities from Asia, Africa, South America, and that represented 28,318 interviews. So this is a huge survey. The telephone survey was conducted in English, in French, and in 15 heritage languages, and it covered 12 themes, which is way beyond just discrimination. But of course, we're going to focus on the results of the discrimination section of the survey, but only a few items. We discussed the results, then focusing on how respondents experienced discrimination. And that was published, by the way, in 2000. That study was studied. That particular focus was published by myself and my colleagues in 2017. So the next slide, please. The first questions dealing with discrimination in the ethnic diversity survey was worded as follows. I'm going to just read it, but so discrimination may happen when people are treated unfairly because they are seen as being different from others. In the past 5 years, do you feel that you experienced discrimination or being treated unfairly by others in Canada because of your ethnicity, culture, race, skin color, language, accent, or religion? And the respondents simply had to say on the phone, yes or no. So for the 42,476 Canadian responses in these interviews, 8% of men and 7% of women said that they had experienced discrimination in the past 5 years. Also, 20% of the visible minorities of different ethnic origin said that they experienced discrimination compared to 5% of white respondents of English and French Canadian background in general. That's a general trend. So we'll go to the next slide. So I can't point here, but anyway, I'll say a few things about this slide. So this is a slide that shows discrimination reported by Francophones and Anglophone respondents in percentage based on their mother tongue in Quebec and the rest of Canada. And I'll just talk about the Quebec results, which are in blue for Quebec. The rest of Canada is in red, but we don't have time for the others. So here what we do is we look at mother tongue, and as you can see, the French mother tongue respondents, 7% of French mother tongue respondents said they had experienced discrimination. But English mother tongue persons in Quebec, I'm only talking about Quebec, 25% of the Anglophones in Quebec said they had been victim of discrimination. And allophones in Quebec, 20%, people who didn't have French or English as a mother tongue, said that they had been victim of discrimination in Quebec. So that already has a sort of a flavor of linguicism because it's based on the mother tongue. Okay, the next slide. So then we said, of those people who said they had been victim of discrimination, only those, we said, well, under what circumstances did you, or what reasons were you sort of the victim of discrimination? And here we're only looking at Quebec. So for this sample, what we're looking at is francophones who say that they were a victim of discrimination because of their ethnicity, and that's 27%. So 27% of Quebec francophones said that it was because of their ethnicity. 20% of the francophones said that it was because of race or the color of their skin. And then we have 61% of francophones who say that it was because of their language or accent. And that's the greatest number that we have as a reason for being a victim of discrimination. And religion at that time for francophones was 10%. Now, what happened with the anglophones? Where there they are in red. So for anglophones, 10% said that it was because of their ethnicity or culture. 25% said it was because of the color of their skin. And as you can see there in the red bar graph, uh, we have 67% of Quebec anglophones who said it was because of their language or accent, and only 9% because of religion. So what you can see in this slide is that linguicism is the main reason why people experience discrimination in Quebec. It's about language and accent. Next slide. The next slide, we asked the people who said they had been a victim of discrimination. We said, well, where did you experience this discrimination? Where did it happen? So for Quebec mother tongue speakers, 22% said that it happened on the street. That's in blue. Okay. Then 33% of francophones said that it was in stores for restaurants and banks, for example. And then we also had for work setting, including job application and job promotion, 42% said that it was in the workplace that they experienced the most discrimination. And very little with relations with the police, only 3%, or at school, 5%. Now, what happened to the anglophones? Well, for the anglophones, it was 25% that it happened on the street. They said there's only those who said they had experienced discrimination. 50% said that it happened on the street or in stores. And we have 47% who said in the employment situation. And then 23% with the police. So what we're saying here is that it's in the work world and in the retail settings that anglophones report the greatest amount of discrimination that they experience in Quebec. For allophones, I'm just going to say that for allophones, those who have neither French or English as a mother tongue, you have 57% who said it was at the work setting, including job application and job promotion. So allophones, having neither French or English as a mother tongue, another language, feel that a lot of their discrimination is in the work setting. All this to say that the work setting for both Francophone, Anglophone, and Allophone is the setting where there's the most discrimination felt by for these people. So the next slide. Then we have a survey, CHSSN crop survey of a representative sample of the Quebec Anglophone population on their equal access to jobs in Quebec government and the federal government that was published in 2012. Question was as follows to only Quebec Anglophones. Do you believe that Anglophones have equal access to jobs with the government of Quebec? And then Jedwab said he gave sort of four definitions. You can think of yourself as an anglophone in four different ways, and we're going to ask you the question four times. It's a bit repetitious, but still it kind of gives a flavor. So for English mother tongue, only 15% said that they felt they had equal access to a Quebec government job, And 76% said, I don't have equal access. For those who refer themselves to English as a home language, they felt that was part of their being anglophone, 16% said that they had equal access, 75% said they did not. Likewise, language identification as an anglophone. 15% said, yes, I have equal access. 77% say, I don't. And finally, English as a language of work or school. 16% say they have equal access to jobs in the Quebec government. And 78% say, no, I didn't have equal access. Okay. The numbers are different for the same respondents as regards access to Quebec, to the government of Canada. For example, for anglophones based on mother tongue, 38% say they do have access to government jobs in Canada. As home language, 39% equal access. English language identification as an anglophones, 37.8%, and language of work, 45%. So you can see there's a difference between the two types of government jobs, and where it's most difficult is for Quebec government jobs for anglophones. The next slide. Is the final slide. Are anglophone minority disadvantaged compared to francophone majority in Quebec? Yes, in general. Anglophones have a lower annual median income. Yes. Anglophones have a higher unemployment rate. Yes. Anglophones have higher poverty rate. Yes. Anglophones feel they are being victim of linguicism. Yes. Most Anglos experience discrimination at work and in stores. Yes. Most Anglophones perceive they don't have equal access to Quebec government jobs. Yes. Therefore, it is recommended that Anglophones be included as a sixth minority group within the employment equity program of the Quebec government. So this is it for the the overview. And now we're open for questions and answers. Merci, thank you, gracias, grazie, etc. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Richard, for a very stimulating presentation. I think you make a strong case. I have a first question from the chat. Reminder, please put your questions in the chat. That's how we're taking questions today. Question from Mary Moliner, or Marie Moliner. If this is not addressed in the slides, how do Anglophones and Francophones feel they are treated when receiving public services? So, beyond, you looked at police, but, public services from the Quebec government, healthcare, education, municipal governments. Is there any data on that?
On services, you mean, huh? On whether or not they're getting services from Quebec government?
Yes, which would justify, greater Anglophone representation to ensure that those needs are taken.
We haven't got as much data on services. The closest, there are some smaller studies for particular settings, but they're few and far between, and I don't know many of them actually that have been done recently. So, what you usually get from the Office québécois de la langue française et le commissaire de la langue française is they say that, for example, francophone, they focus only on francophone. They say francophones, when they go into a store, la langue d'accueil, the welcoming language, sometimes is in English rather than French. And of course, from the Office québécois de la langue française, it should be 100%. But then when they look at the language of service, then it's virtually 100% in French. So from the francophone point of view, the service in French is very strong, but they haven't asked anglophones. So this is the typical problem of not having enough research on the language of service in the different public administrations of the Quebec government. Now, being a social psychologist, we could run studies to do this, and we could do like what the Office québécois de la langue française does, which is sending out civil servants in the stores, passing as clients and waiting for the service to be offered either to the welcoming to be offered either in French or in English, and then seeing whether the service is actually given. So you could have experimenters, we could say, that would solicit different services from the Quebec government, and then we would have the same person who would address themselves in French or address themselves, or speak in French or speak in English, and see what the response rate is. So from an experimental point of view, you could do it. From a sociolinguistic point of view, you could do it. Just that we haven't done very much of that.
Thank you, Richard. I know from our end at Questcren, we did a research brief recently on early childhood education, which did indicate that Anglophones felt they had difficulty accessing a lot of those services in English. And
That's
we're going to release a brief soon on health services, and there's also some numbers there indicating that there's sometimes a struggle to access some of those services. So there are some numbers out there, but compiling them, they're different places, but that would certainly strengthen the argument there that there's a
Yeah,
sense
that would be
of
good.
satisfaction.
Yeah.
I'm going to see if there's any other questions in the chat. Please, I encourage. Oh, here's a question from Lorraine O'Donnell. Hi, Richard. What possible barriers might prevent the Quebec government from implementing your proposal? For instance, given that most Quebec civil servants are L1 francophones, what biases might exist that would make them reluctant to do so?
Okay. That's like any other reticences that we've had across the Western world regarding the inclusion of non-majority members in work units of either private or government institutions. So sometimes you have reticence on the basis of ethnicity, on language, on sexual orientation, you name it. The usual reaction from people is of the majority is to be a little bit wary of welcoming people that are not members of their own group. That's sort of a normal reaction, just because you don't know much about our groups, minorities, who could join you in a work unit. So it's just sometimes the fear of the unknown. Usually, when you then get people to work together or to be together, they realize that in fact they share more in common than differences in terms of values, in terms of many, on virtually, most important issues. So it's always a question of how you present the inclusion of minorities within a work unit or a public administration or a private organization, is how you set it up so that the first reluctance of fear of the unknown is reduced so that you can welcome people of different origins within your work unit. And so the issue, whether it's about French and English, but it could be visible minorities, as you saw, indigenous people. So for all of these, there can be some reticence. Now, in the Canadian federal government, they actually follow through on employment equity, and then they go further into looking at retention. If you don't have a good system of welcoming minorities within your work unit, what happens is that the visible minority or the whatever minority it is, you lose retention. In other words, they end up not leaving the work unit if they're not well welcome for so long. So there's a lot of work to be done, and sometimes you do it a little bit from the point of view of DEI training. You do a bit of DEI training for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and you do all types of interventions to sort of make it easier for people to accept different people within their immediate work unit. It can be accepted at a general level, but the troubles or the issues come how are you going to welcome these people in your own work unit on an everyday basis? This is where the crunch is. So that's a challenge, and it's never over. When it's not one group, it'll be another group that is stigmatized or disadvantaged or not well perceived. So that's a challenge in organizational psychology, and there's controversy in the U.S. about the DEI training. So that was a start, but there's a lot of work to be done to help that happen properly. So it's a big issue.
Thank you, Rishan. And here's a kind of follow-up question. So you gave a lot of examples of subjective feelings among Anglophones that they don't have equal access, but Sam Bosky is asking, is there any available data on systemic barriers to the hiring of Anglophone in the Quebec public service, which is not the same as, subjective feelings?
Uh, Given that the requirement that you have a proficiency in French, in the same way that allophones had to prove that they pass the test in French to be able to work in French in the Quebec public administration, or visible minorities, or Indigenous people, um, would there be a systemic exception for Anglophones? Well, Anglophones have been stereotyped for a long time in the history books and in public parlance as being en québécois, at UQAM, we used to say, c'est quoi la bébite au Québec, là? Well, it was very often when I asked them, it wasn't indigenous people, it was les Anglais. So there's a there's a long history of French-English relation, la conquête and all that. So there's a lot of historical and stereotyping and stuff going on about French and the English. So one thing we can say is that Quebec Anglophones know a lot about Quebec Francophones, and Quebec Francophones also know a lot about uh, Quebec Franc Anglophones. And there's a long history of relations in institutional units, such as in municipalities, where Francophone and Anglophones have worked together all over the province for decades, if not centuries. So I don't know of any systemic uh, uh, proven or scientifically proven restrictions. There might be some. I doubt it, but there could be. So the point is, it's like for all the other visible minorities and indigenous minorities, and even handicapped people have had to work. That there probably were some systemic reluctance towards having people other than those who look like ourselves in the Quebec public administration. And then the rest of the work is about diversity training. It's about getting the first ones to come in and to show that they're just like us, just about. So that's the issue. From an organizational perspective, there's a lot of work to be done.
And on a related note, and I guess it's relates to the next question too. There's also a public perception among a lot of Francophones that Anglophones are not a disadvantaged group, that they're a privileged group. And Andy Riga asks, has there been any research or polling on how Francophones perceive the economic status of Anglophones? Now, before you go into that, Richard, I'd like to point our the lunch and learn before this one, which was with the commissioner, a member of the Commissioner of Official Languages, who recently released a study entitled Building Bridges, Perceptions and Realities about the English-Speaking Communities of Quebec and Their Relationship with French. And there's a lot of polling. It's a major
Okay.
in how Francophones perceive Anglophones. So that's an interesting study there.
And
Do
is
you
this
know of
one
any
that
others, Vishal?
sorry?
Do you know of any other studies where
No, no, not a
related to
recent
this
one.
question?
Not a recent one. No. I think there's a lot of work to be done to do that. There'll be a lot of I think that some of the data I showed are pretty basic data. Um, you could wait 10 years for 10 years of research to show it even more. I wouldn't want it to slow down the idea of maybe adding the sixth group, not wait too long for the next research.
Fair enough. Um, and there's a link to that study that I just mentioned in the chat there, the study from the Commissioner of Official Languages.
Yeah, Monsieur P.
Um, So if you have more questions, please put them in the Q&A box. I'm not seeing any others. If you put questions in the quick chat, please transfer them to the Q&A box so I can see them. I guess I have a question of my own. Um, um, a few years ago, I applied in the concours to join the Quebec Public Administration, and anglophones were included as a kind of vague target, but with no target numbers, not included in the programme d'accès. So there was one question on there, and they asked you to define yourself, are you part of this group? And at the time, the definition was première langue apprise et toujours parlée. So first, do you have English as your first language learned and still spoken?
Yeah.
Now, I grew up in a bilingual household, so I didn't know whether to tick yes or no, but I ticked it anyway. And I think that applies to a lot of people, who grew up speaking multiple languages. So, it seemed like a problematic definition to me. Um, because there's a lot of gray areas. What do you think would be, how do you define this group would be my first question. What's the best possible way to define this group as inclusive or in an inclusive large way, in a narrow way? And how do you go about verifying that, do you trust people based on their self-declaration or do you ask for whatever, un certificat d'admissibilité à l'école anglaise, so
Yeah. Yeah.
what would be the best way to manage all this?
Well, in my sense, you know, when you complete your Canadian census by law, you're obliged to complete it in a veridical way. Okay,
Right.
by law. So, and then we use that data for Statistics Canada now for almost 100 years. And we base a lot of public policies on these self-declarations in the Canadian census. So to me, a self-declaration in line with criteria of the Canadian census should be sufficient. Now, if somebody wants to make a special law which says, well, in the case of anglophones, you're going to have to prove it by showing that one of your parents went to an English school somewhere in Canada, uh, to me, that would be abusive simply because, well, for Canadian census, we don't check up like that with special documents to prove that somebody is an allophone or a first official language speaker. So I see self-declaration as the criteria, and for allophones, uh, for linguistic for the minorities that don't have French or English as a mother tongue, well, that puts them in sort of an allophone category, you could say. And there again, it's self-declaration, and to me, self-declaration is sufficient. The U.S. Bureau of Census also uses self-declaration. In fact, most censuses in the world use self-declaration with a law which says you have to be veridical. So to me, that would be a sufficient criteria. If you ask that question and you say, English is my mother tongue and the language I'm still using at home or that I'm using at home with another language, but mother tongue, mixture of mother tongue. That's why I mentioned the three criteria as a first official language spoken, knowledge, mother tongue, and languages at home. When you have those three things going towards anglophone and using English quite a lot, then that's it. That's the self-declaration.
Okay, great.
Don't need anything else.
All right, let me see. Oh, are there any other questions? Um, okay, I see some questions. I see some comments. All right. There's all of a sudden there's 5 different questions that appeared in the Q&A box. So, Lorraine O'Donnell says, "Hi again. Sometimes getting the facts out is not enough. If it was, we would not have a climate crisis, for instance. Your facts are compelling, but as you mentioned, the research has been out for a while. What do you think it would take for the Quebec government to act on this?"
I think that what happened with the other, first of all, we could look at what the other uh, five groups, how they were selected. And so for women, there was no question, but there was, when it was done, the women's movement in Quebec made it very clear that they wanted to have access a better access to employment job and government jobs. And so that's why women were right up there at the top. But there was mobilization. In fact, there was mobilization for visible minorities as well. Um, so it's normal that you would have some uh, mobilization to say, yeah, we're on board with that as our minorities. So ethnic minorities, which by definition was including some aspect of being allophones. Um, these all involve some degree of mobilization on the part of the minorities that would be targeted. And it is for social cohesion and social harmony that you have an equity employment program because you want to also serve your communities at large in the Quebec population with a public service that can answer and that can help everybody to feel at home as regards these different services offered by the Quebec government. So I would expect that that a certain amount of mobilization would be necessary to show that that's something that the community wants, that they feel that they will be better integrated in Quebec society if more of them are in the public administration and they can better serve that community. And that was pretty well what the targeted groups of the Programme d'accès à l'égalité à l'emploi, that's how they got named. And the handicapped people had to fight to get it because they were not included in 2001. I think they were included in 2012 or 15. I don't remember. But so it took them, the physically handicapped, a lot of mobilization to convince the uh, uh, la Commission des droits de la personne that they were an important group to include. And it's the Commission des droits de la personne and its membership that decide basically on the merits of the minorities that they want to propose to the government as being included in the Quebec public administration within the Programme d'accès à l'égalité à l'emploi. So it's you and the people working in that body of the Commission des droits de la personne, they're all people who have been involved at some point in their life with some mobilization for a particular minority. Some it's children, some it's visible minorities, some it's sexual orientation. So all these people, they're committed people. They have a good heart, and I think they can listen to a point about another minority that would like to be included. So I think that a certain amount of mobilization is necessary. It's not just a data situation. It has to show that you have to show that you need that for better cohesion and social harmony within Quebec society.
Thank you, Richard. It's our presentation is drawing to a close soon, and there's many other questions in the chat. I had a quick look at them. A lot of them relate to, you've given indicators on socio-economic, problems with the English-speaking population with relation to the majority population, underrepresentation, a perception of discrimination. These are all strong arguments to push for PAEE. A lot of people in the question and answer boxes are asking, how could we create a study looking at if there is systemic discrimination? And we won't go into that answer now, but that's an interesting question, and it's certainly one, I'd be interested in pursuing with you, Richard, and others who are interested in pursuing this question. But our Lunch and Learn is drawing to a close. I'd like to thank you all for attending today's event. And the best way to learn about what's coming up in our programming is to sign up for our newsletter, the QR code, which is on the screen. And if you haven't already, or to follow us on Facebook, please follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn, the handles for which are also on the screen. Our evaluation survey will appear in your browsers once we close this meeting. And in closing, we again recognize the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, Gouvernement du Québec, and our other funders, Canadian Heritage and Concordia University. Thank you again to Richard for your presentation today, and thank you to my colleague Anna Hunt for her technical support today. See you next time.
Bonjour. Bonjour.